Okay, so for this week, we're going to explore Filipino immigrants and how they were racialized. Um, and we're going to look at an example of political racialization vis-a-vis the Tiding-McDuffie's Act of 1934, uh, economic racialization in terms of the dual wage system and ethnic antagonism on the plantations, and social racialization in terms of anti-miscegenation laws. All right. So, one thing that makes Filipino immigrants different than other Asian immigrants was that Filipino migrants, when they came to the U.S., they came mainly as nationals of the U.S. because the Philippines was colonized by the U.S., as I mentioned in the lecture notes. Um, so shortly after the Spanish-American War of 1898, uh, America took over control and formed a government there on the Philippines. And that allowed Filipinos subjects to go to the U.S., even though there was a restriction on Asian migration to the U.S., but Filipinos were not considered Asian migrants at that time. However, it also created a us versus them, because if we're going to colonize the Philippines, we're going to colonize them because we have this kind of mindset of us versus them being less civilized, them being children who need us to protect them and to bring them into history and to bring them into modernity. So an example of this, if you look at the PowerPoint, you'll see the picture of the 1909 Yukon Pacific Exposition of an Igorot. Igorot are an indigenous tribe in the Philippines. You'll see their village, and then you'll see in slide number 5 a photo of the American, and you see how they're all dressed up in their Victorian clothes, but yet the Filipinos are half dressed, right? And the Americans will, and the Americans and the Europeans and the Westerners, right, will look at this and read it as them being primitive and savage and animal-like, and by extension, not very human. And if that's the case, then we can dominate them, we can colonize them, and we can use them, and we can exploit them. It's the same way of thinking vis-a-vis slaves, or the genocide of the indigenous Americans across the U.S. landscape. And here's just slide 6 is just another example of a gentleman wearing his suit, sitting next to a group of Igorot villagers who are primitive outside of history. So there was a popular racial discourse at that time, of that period, that America was colonizing the Philippines because we needed to civilize the Philippines. We're civilizing the Filipinos. And it brings to mind the great poem by Kipling, known as The White Man's Burden. The Filipino being uncivilized are a burden to the white man, and just like the indigenous of America were uncivilized and was a burden to the white man, and so the white man would need to bring them along into progress, into modernity, into civilization, and that required a lot of work, and that necessitated violence and oppression and um, and domination. So history, capital H history, is white man's march towards progress and modernity. And this kind of idea is anchored in a Christian worldview, a Christian telos about the end. For Christian, the end is a great, um, heavenly world that is better than this material world. and history would be this kind of linear uphill progression towards that very end. And so if we have to civilize the Filipinos, that means that they are outside of that progress, outside of that line of history. And so we need to civilize them and bring them in, and therefore that's why they're such a burden. So some examples of Filipino racialization: the Tidings-Maduffy Act, right? The Tidings-Maduffy Act made it look like it was something good for the Filipinos. We're going to make the Philippines an independent sovereign nation state by 1934. However, uh, if that happens, Filipinos are no longer American nationals, and therefore they would be restricted from immigrating as cheap Asian labor, right? So that and this passed because Filipinos were becoming an economic threat to white laborers, just as the Chinese, the Japanese, and the South Asians before them. And you have economic racialization in terms of the dual wage system, paying Filipinos much less than white workers, or much less than Japanese or Chinese workers, so that they would fight each other and not fight the power that's paying them so much less. And anti-miscegenation laws apply to Filipinos, because and those laws are laws that prohibited a white from marrying a non-white. So a white from marrying a black or an Indian, and this applied to Filipinos as well. And because of this, Filipinos had to marry Mexican or indigenous or other Asians to start their families. So as you read, look at how Filipinos were racialized economically, politically, and socially, and compare them. Start to compare them in your mind with Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, and South Asians.